Welcome back to our series on Bach's Orgelbüchlein. Today we're looking at one of the Christmas preludes, Puer natus in Bethlehem. It's perhaps not one of the best known, it's not one of the most dramatic, it's not one of the hardest to play, and yet there is something about this piece that is an enigma. It has puzzled me for years. And there are two things in particular which I want to talk about today. The one is the general tone of the piece, the tenor of the piece if you like, and the other thing is the ending. So we'll deal with those two things and look at performance issues along with them. So let's start with the general tone of the piece. The chorale itself is, as I say, a Christmas piece, Puer natus in Bethlehem. It's translated from Latin into German in the 1400s, the early 1400s, if I remember rightly, and from there into Danish and into all the Scandinavian languages and then into English and most other languages as well. And it's sung all over the world, except, oddly enough, in Germany, where it isn't sung any longer, although it is still sung in German if you go to Switzerland, for some reason. However, the text itself is a very simple recounting of the main elements of the Christmas story. So it starts with the child or the boy born in Bethlehem to great jubilation in Jerusalem and alleluias at the end of every verse. And then the second verse goes on to say he was put into a crib with the ox and the ass looking on and acknowledging his divinity. And then the three kings turn up from the east, and so on and so on and so on. So the whole story is portrayed in terms almost like a medieval painting, in very broad brushstrokes, very colourful, very simple language. And that, I'm sure, is why the hymn is used very much in family services. It's used as a firm favourite for Sunday schools and children's services all over the place, because it recounts the main elements of the story in such a simple and colourful way. The melody that is commonly used also is a simple, sounds rather medieval melody, and it's very rhythmic, rather bouncy. It's the kind of thing that you would expect to hear played with shawms and drums in some Disney film of the Middle Ages. So if you or I were to write a chorale prelude on this particular hymn and this particular melody, what would it sound like? Not as good as Bach's, obviously, but how would it sound? I think it would be joyful, it would be a little bit brash, a little bit rhythmic, bold, happy. And what's Bach's chorale prelude like? It's really the complete opposite. It's quiet, it's rather slow, restrained, and actually some of the harmonies become really rather dark and depressing as the piece goes on. What has Bach got in mind? Well, we don't know, obviously. As you know, I'm always very sceptical when people say, well, this particular motif means that Bach was thinking of this particular thing. But there's been suggestions that Bach's rocking motif in this piece is a kind of cradle song, and that's why it's quiet. And that would tie in with the second verse where he's put into the cradle or into the crib. It's possible. And it's probably the best explanation that there is. Why do the harmonies turn rather dark and serious towards the end? Maybe that's Bach foreshadowing the later story, the Passiontide story, of where this child goes. I don't know, but it's a possibility. In any event, that is how the piece is, and that's how we have to play it. I remember that when I first learnt this piece as a teenager, I really wanted to make it a happy and bouncy piece, and I played it rather faster, or tried to play it rather faster, and with a bright registration, and it simply didn't work. And quite soon I had to acknowledge that no, that was not the nature of this particular piece. The harmonic rhythm tells you so, that it is a slower tempo, and, as I say, the figuration and the nature of the harmonies also forces you to take it rather easier. Where does that leave our performance practice issues that we usually talk about? I think a registration that is a little restrained, so not too bright, and also a tempo. The melody itself demands a 3 in a bar. It mustn't turn into a 6 in a bar, so it mustn't go so slowly. Dee-da, dee-da, da, 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 dum. It can't go much slower and still retain its characteristics. But at the same time, those quaver movements and the quaver figuration demand that we take it slow enough to make sense of those. And again, the fact that the repeated quaver rocking motion suggests that it will very naturally fall into twos, and it's quite natural to slur the dia-dum-ba pattern in twos, and that's absolutely fine. I said that there were two questions, and the second one is to do with the ending. So here is the ending according to the old Bach Gesellschaft edition, and here it is according to its successor, the Neuen Bach-Ausgabe. And you'll see that the Bach Gesellschaft edition ends on a chord with a tenor B natural, while the Neue Bach-Ausgabe has a repeat with first and second time bars and ends on bare Gs. So how on earth can two editions interpret the same thing so differently? Well, let's have a look at Bach's manuscript. It's one of those pieces where Bach didn't have quite enough room and had to run over onto the next page, which he didn't originally intended for Lob sei Gott in des Himmels Thron. We can see that Bach completes the piece and writes his double bar line. That bar is only 2 beats, incidentally, because the piece started on the 3rd beat. But when you hit that final double bar, the piece is obviously unfinished because the tenor line is on a passing note. But Bach has written something there in the tenor part, and that something is rather similar to the sign that Bach writes when he wants a repeat. You can see it here in Herr Christ, der einige Gottessohn. It's clearest perhaps in the first of the 2 red circles that I've drawn. So the editors of the Neue Bach-Ausgabe interpret that as meaning that Bach wants the entire piece repeating from the beginning. And you'll see that in the bass stave there are 2 fermatas, one under the bottom G and one under the tenor G. So the NBA's interpretation is that the second time round the piece ends there with the 3 Gs. Now I have an enormous respect for the editors of the Neue Bach-Ausgabe, and I hesitate very to stick my neck out and disagree with them, but I'm going to do it anyway. Let's look again at that manuscript. So let's look at the double bar that closes Puer natus and at the double bars announcing the repeats, for instance in Herr Christ, der einige Gottessohn. You'll see that Bach indicates a repeat here by drawing 4 little lines between the double bars. That's in the gaps between the lines of the staves, in other words. It's simply not there in Puer natus. Bach does this consistently. He has 2 methods actually of writing repeat signs in the Orgelbüchlein manuscript, either in that way or in a more recognisably modern way with a double line preceded by dots. Every single instance, I've been right through the Orgelbüchlein manuscript, and every time there is a repeat, Bach writes one or other of those. On 6 occasions he uses the sign with the dots, and in the remaining occasions he uses the double bar with the 4 strokes between them. So he never indicates a repeat without writing that kind of a sign, either the one or the other. But in Puer natus he does not do so. And then again, look at this little sign, the one which is interpreted as a repeat indication. It is superficially similar to the one in Herr Christ, der einige Gottessohn, but slightly different. Neither of the signs actually is written in quite the same way. But what else could it be? Well, I would suggest that the first letter is a letter T. It is how Bach writes a T. And the second letter is exactly how Bach writes the letter H at the ends of words, which incidentally is quite different from how he writes the letter H at the beginning or the middle of a word. So it's TH. And the letter H, of course, in German is a B natural, which is why you can have a fugue on BACH. So personally, I would read this as tenor B natural. In other words, a shorthand way of just continuing the chord in the other parts and adding a B natural in the tenor, which actually is precisely what the old Bach Gesellschaft edition writes, although they don't explain their reasons for doing so. Elsewhere in Orgelbüchlein, Bach does use shorthand to write in things which suddenly occur to him, or where he suddenly finds himself in a situation where he doesn't want to carry on writing the notes. So it's not unique. Interestingly, Walter Emery, another editor for whom I have huge respect, did the same thing in his edition for Novello, again without explaining why. So that's my reasoning. First of all, no other piece in Orgelbüchlein repeats the entire piece, and there seems to be no reason, liturgical or otherwise, for doing so. Secondly, the sign that the Neubach-Ausgabe editors have interpreted as being the repeat sign is, in my view, different from how Bach writes the repeat sign. Thirdly, Bach never indicates a repeat without a double bar adapted for a repeat, and there isn't one in this case. And fourthly, I think that those two words read TH, in other words, tenor B. So those are my reasons for following actually the Bach Gesellschaft version, or Walter Emery's version. And at that I am at variance with the Neubach-Ausgabe and modern scholarship, and I apologize for that. But I'm putting that forward as my case for doing so. Well, I hope you'll enjoy playing this piece at Christmas.